Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, finally released its final climate risk disclosure rules, which those of us in the climate space have been eagerly awaiting. It's been quite a wait. In addition, California recently passed its own climate laws, too, in fact. And both of these new sets of reporting requirements may apply to many more companies than you might think. And they will affect most of us, no matter where we live, work, or do business. I know, policy, regulations, reporting requirements, it may sound boring or wonky or like something you can ignore if you're not a lawyer or in finance, but you can't ignore them. You can't. Because if you don't comply, you can be in really big trouble. And what other companies need, they might need from you. So it's worth knowing a certain amount about these. So let's dive in a little bit. The information these requirements reveal is valuable for our businesses and frankly, our careers too, as well as the planet. Today, we're going to get a sense of what a typical business person or climate advocate needs to know, understand about them, from a woman who's been a leader in this space at one of the top global firms. She helps policymakers and corporate leaders wrestle these issues every day. So adjust your earphones, grab a pen and paper or your tablet to take notes and listen up. Welcome to Electric Ladies Podcast. We share stories, insights, tips, and advice from remarkably innovative women working on the front lines of corporate responsibility, energy, sustainability, and ESG-related issues. I'm your host, Joan Michelson. We talk about innovation, technology, leadership, and careers, always bringing a new perspective. We also give career advice in every episode, especially at the end, but it's sprinkled throughout if you pay close attention. Find us anywhere you like to listen to podcasts, on our website, electricladiespodcast.com, and through my Forbes articles as well. And please pass it on to your friends and leave us a 5-star review if you don't mind. It helps other people find us. If you're at an inflection point yourself, looking for support with your own ESG work or your career, especially in this time of both flux and opportunities, please reach out to me on Twitter and let me know. We can help you no matter what industry you're in. In 2023, last year, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, reports that we had the highest number of weather and climate disasters, over $1 billion with a B, ever in a year's period, 28, costing over $93 billion. And that's actually going to go up. There's a couple in December that I don't think are in that number. That reflects the massive financial impact of climate events. It also reflects why business leaders need to take the impact of the climate on their bottom line into account, and why the investment community and the public good requires us to as well. It's also at the core of why the SEC developed these climate risk disclosure rules. As Christina Wyatt put it, who on our show last year, who led the SEC's task force developing these rules, she said that investors have been clamoring for these rules. They want comparable, reliable, consistent data across companies and industries to make informed investment decisions. And up until now, it's been kind of a hodgepodge of standards and frameworks and mostly voluntary. But we've talked about those, and you can listen to several episodes about those. But in addition to the SEC, California, as I said earlier, policymakers just passed 2 powerful climate disclosure laws as well. And they affect any business that operates in California, which is frankly thousands of them around the US and around the globe. The impact is profound. So let's find out what we need to know and ask an expert. I'd like you to meet Kristen Sullivan. Kristen is an audit and assurance partner with Deloitte and leads the firm's sustainability and ESG services. She also serves as the firm's global audit and assurance, sustainability, and climate services leader and the integrated reporting community of practice leader. Say that 3 times fast. She has spent her entire career at Deloitte. I interviewed her a couple of years ago about reliable financial, climate, and ESG data, and we'll put a link to that episode in the show notes as well. Full disclosure, I worked at Deloitte myself. You probably heard me mention that in previous conversations, but I only wish I knew Kristen when I was there. I might still be there if I had. Kristen has authored many publications on sustainability and ESG issues, disclosure, blah, 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 garnered many awards. She was recently named a 2022 Women in Sustainability Leadership Award winner. Yay, Kristen earned her degrees at University of Virginia and Eureka College. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kristen Sullivan back to Electric Ladies podcast. Kristen, thank you for joining me.
Hi, Joan. It's so great to be with you.
Thank you. So give us your first take. Like, what's your overall take on the SEC rules? Like a top line, here we go.
The headline. Well, we have a rule, so I think that's a big development in terms of the 24 months and the waiting, the 24,000 comment letters that the SEC received clearly indicated the importance and the attention within the capital markets around this ambitious set of objectives. And just I think picking out or pulling on a little bit more, one of the themes that you raised in your intro, the important emphasis on the financial relevance of climate-related impacts and risks in particular. We've seen over the past, as you well know, 20 plus years, this momentum in the increase of transparency, disclosure as an avenue to drive trust and strengthen sort of strategic focus and really communicate with stakeholders around how organizations are increasingly understanding, prioritizing, measuring, and then ultimately acting on, as well as disclosing information around climate-related risks and opportunities. And so this sort of groundswell, this evolution in the regulatory landscape is a natural, I think, continuation of, this market, almost this insatiable appetite for information in the market. But yet, even recognizing, and we just released some research, Deloitte research, that indicated that 97% of S&P 500 organizations provided some climate risk disclosure in their filings, in their SEC filings. But investors continue to, as you quoted previously, feel that they need more consistent, timely, reliable information. And so, enter regulation and standards to help drive that accountability, right? To bring some consistency, timeliness to the proliferation of information so that it can actually be used, relied upon, and really serve as a catalyst to unlock that capital allocation that's going to be so incredibly important to accelerate the transition to a decarbonized economy. And so I think, from my perspective, the headline is the SEC rule is critical. It is critical, the largest capital markets in the world, a stake in the ground as we start to see the implementation period start to take shape and companies really mobilize. But I think it's also important to recognize that companies are not, U.S. publicly listed companies are not solely focused on the SEC disclosure requirements. They are increasingly impacted by a whole universe of other disclosure requirements. And I know we'll get into this a little, namely the EU and California as one of, I think, some momentum that we're really following closely. And so it's critical. It's a pivotal moment in sort of corporate disclosure in the market, and a really important one that many organizations are rapidly turning their attention to because the requirements are significant.
I bet. And as an accounting firm and doing assurance, you guys are put in the position of having to say and assure that the data is reliable. So, does it make you nervous?
Well, as you mentioned, Joan, we've been working on this for decades in terms
you've been doing this a long time. Yeah.
For, as we think about as a professional services firm, we serve the public interest. We have a public interest role in the market. As you think about our role as public company auditors, importantly, as well as the way in which we advise our clients to prepare, to think strategically, to really emphasize the importance of clear governance structures that establish a control environment, integrating considerations into the business, into the enterprise risk, the strategy. And really, when you think and you look at these requirements, namely the SEC rule, the organizing framework really starts with, governance, strategy, risk, and then measurement and disclosure. I think, as you indicate, the emphasis by regulators around the world is clearly on disclosure. That's critical, but it's not only disclosure. That role of assurance is so incredibly important to really help instill the trust in this information and the confidence that it can be used to inform decisions. And so, as part of this sort of bringing that standardization, consistency, and reliability to information flow, this ESG data management value chain, assurance is so incredibly important. And there's a lot of nuance and considerations that are unique to more traditional financial reporting that we've been at the game of audits of financial statements for a very long time. This information is evolving. There are standards that are evolving, and we can dig into that a little bit more, but those really create that foundation, that critical foundation to drive rigorous adherence to criteria, those specific requirements, risk protection, right? As you look to a standard to really guide what you report or what you don't report, and really ensure that assurability.
Oh, thank you for that. And also, part of the point of a lot of this is for investors to have comparable data, to be able to compare apples and apples, right? Compare publicly traded companies in the same industry against each other. And part of what's happened until now is with the voluntary reporting is that companies were just doing what you would expect. They'd report what they wanted and not what they didn't, basically. I want to get into your take on the California rules in a minute, but you touched on something that I think I want to go to now, which is materiality. It's a key word in these rules. It's something that most people who don't have your level of education on audit issues or are not in the CFO chain really understand. So tell us what materiality really is and what the impact of the focus on materiality in the SEC rules in particular. It's also true in the California rules, but it's something that was a change from the proposed rules to now, to the final ones in particular. There was a change in how much is considered, or what's considered materiality. So talk about that for a minute.
Yeah. Well, I think, materiality is really a frame of reference. The foundation is really to understand the information needs of your intended audience, to contemplate what information, that total mix of information is the reference point in the Supreme Court definition of materiality, to really apply judgment in terms of what information either included or absence of certain information in the total mix of information would influence the user's decisions about the performance. And in this case, the SEC really emphasized that materiality definition and how it applies to this climate-related information. So really honing in on material climate-related risks as it relates to the evaluation of materiality around, for example, GHG emissions. There were a handful of examples that were provided, and I think it's a really complex analysis that organizations are increasingly going to need to proceed through in really thinking about both the quantitative and qualitative considerations of materiality for purposes of information included in an SEC filing. And just as we've been saying, even so far in this conversation, companies can't ignore the requirements and or disclosures that they already make in other forms of whether it's regulatory requirements, state jurisdictional requirements, whether it's voluntary disclosure. 23,000 companies report to the CDP, the former Carbon Disclosure Project, which its intended purpose was to create a mechanism of information for purposes of investor information and decision making. And so I think there's just a number of additional factors. It doesn't just come down to a percentage of the GHG emissions that would be or would not be material to an investor. There's a number of other factors that organizations will need to consider.
Yeah, I also kind of simplified it a lot of times for people that it would have a material impact on the bottom line, on their financials, which is obviously what, investors particularly care about. What's your take, overall on the California rules and which, if there's companies will have to, who do business in California will need to do those, but is there a point where one or the other will supersede, if you will? If they do one, do they not have? I would imagine you always have to do the SEC rules if you're publicly traded, period, end of discussion. Mm-hmm. But can they just submit what they file with the SEC to California? How does that, what's the interplay there as well, if you don't mind?
Yeah. Well, and maybe I'll just take the opportunity to just, frame the sort of information needs and expectations, whether it's California, the EU, the SEC, just to be really clear that, again, a U.S. global multinational who's going to be subject to all of these requirements really needs to focus on, the purpose of these, whether it's policy, regulation, other requirements. So when you look at, again, the SEC's objectives to really help promote more consistent standard information, reliable information around climate-related risks. So that's very clearly that sort of definitional criteria. California clearly is a policy, so legislation that now is going through the process of being implemented into regulation by the California Air Resources Board. The two bills that you mentioned, the 253, really unpack the SEC's climate proposal at the time, right? One was focused on the data, the climate accountability component, 253, and one was focused on the risk. Both look to the recognized standards in the market today. So the GHG protocol is the leading standard to guide measurement and reporting disclosure of GHG emissions. And the SB 261 focus on climate-related risks and look to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is now sunset and now moving under the oversight of the International Financial Reporting Standards body, and so look to sort of successor standards to help guide preparers in disclosing information to be compliant. So I think it's important that those two anchor standards and the continuation of standards are very clearly cited in the California rules, and therefore guide that materiality determination. How do I apply these standards so I can comply with the regulation? Now, coming back to the SEC clearly cites the GHG protocol as a leading standard. The whole sort of organization of the disclosure requirement is sort of organized around this TCFD framework that I mentioned, the governance strategy, risk, and metrics and targets, but doesn't explicitly look to those standards, right? It continues to anchor on materiality as defined by the Supreme Court definition. But as you would look to an organization who practically needs to implement a set of controls and procedures and disclosure practices, really looking to those standards to drive sort of a report once and or measure once, and then figure out how you tailor the disclosure to meet the certain regulatory requirements. And so the standards are so incredibly important to really drive that, establishing the governance and the systems and the processes and controls around the data, so that you're actually managing risk, but you're also preparing with an enhanced level of rigor and timeliness to really be in a position to not only obtain assurance in a timely manner, but to disclose in sort of the timeframes that are required. the California legislation itself specifically looked to an objective to enable organizations to your point, if you're already reporting to the SEC, if you're already reporting to the EU, to the degree possible, enable a company from an efficiency perspective to sort of, dual purpose those disclosures. Now, in practice, we'll have to see. We haven't yet seen the regulation, the implementing regulation for California. But the whole idea is this concept of interoperability. How do you do this once for data through a rigorous process, very standards, in accordance with standards, and how does that best equip you to then be in a position to confidently provide these disclosures to comply with the various regulations?
Cool. And so you just have to make sure that the way you're measuring it gives you the data that you need for all of those bodies that you need to report to, whether it's California, SEC, EU, CSRD, or what, ISSB, whatever, right? So you just have to make sure that you're collecting it in a way that is what you will need for each of those, and hopefully they are in truth interoperable and collected. These rules are already, both sets are being already challenged in court, and they're on hold, but companies still need to prepare. I mean, there's still a demand in the marketplace, which is where this came from, right? This came from the marketplace. So what do you think will be the outcome of the legal challenges, and like, how are you talking to clients about how to prepare in the face of this unknown?
Yeah. Well, I certainly have no insight or perspective exactly on the legal challenges, other than to say, I think legal challenge was anticipated in all avenues, right from the outset. That was something that I think many had expected. I think your point is the important one, which is we have policy, we have legislation out of California that's in process of being translated. We have a rule, we have regulation, and so companies really need to begin to prepare. And when you really start to unpack the requirements, and many organizations are well down the path, especially given some of the drivers from outside of the U.S. While the timelines, in particular with the SEC rule, were extended in terms of as compared to the proposal, the timelines and really the preparation is a multi-year process. When you think about the complexity of this data, the access of this data, even the fact that, as I talked about the standards previously, all of those standards are continuing to evolve, right? So the standards are continuing to evolve, and I think companies really need to act now, to be engaging within the organization. This becomes such an opportunity to drive that sort of integration across all parts of the organization, where historically many in the sustainability team, the operations team, public policy or marketing had really led this sort of voluntary reporting. Now we see that the real critical and compelling need to bring together its finance. This is a whole new ballgame when you think about regulatory disclosures. It's legal, really thinking about, again, the landing on some of these trade-offs and prioritization around what you do say or what you don't say, and the whole evolution of greenwashing, green hushing, and some of those, broader market implications now that we have clarity from a regulatory perspective. And also, the existing mechanisms that companies have in place for continuous feedback with stakeholders. Investors are critical, and they are having a very clear say in terms of the evolution of regulatory requirements. But other stakeholders, that need, you could argue, almost intensifies to really continue to maintain that pulse on what your customers expect, what your future talent expects. So it's a whole set of complex sort of opportunities at play that companies who act now will really be best positioned to capture this opportunity and really lean into with precious resources. Where do I prioritize the effort, and how is that going to actually help me accelerate my strategy? Sort of waiting, it really could risk inefficiency. It could risk the need to rapidly accelerate in ways that could have been anticipated, right, previously. So I do think that the time to act is now, and the timelines are not really that that long in the making, if you will.
Well, considering the systems that need to be put in place in order to make them happen. I think the other one is one of the things that you and I have talked about before is that this isn't just a burden. This is an opportunity, because the data that you collect in this process can help you identify inefficiencies, help you identify market opportunities. I did a client presentation recently on the opportunities from the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act, because, if a company has been looking at revamping their manufacturing system and they have been struggling with how to do it and the expense, now, especially if they're publicly traded or they work with a company that they're in the supply chain of a publicly traded company, they can leverage the new bills and the new financial incentives and funding to make that change. If they do it, they just have to do it in a way that it reduces their carbon footprint, reduces their emissions, et cetera. And so if you don't have the data, you don't know where those opportunities are, right? And so it can help you see. I mean, I had a woman on from a hotel chain who got into doing this work because they saw their energy bill was nuts, So it's not just, oh God, I have to do this. It's, you can find opportunities for savings, new markets, talent the talent picture is changing. People have told me that they're hiring completely differently than they did before as a result. What kind of feedback are you getting on the new rules, both California and SEC?
Yeah. Well, and even picking up on that point, we say often that regulation can really be a catalyst for transformation, for business transformation, because this is so much more than a disclosure and compliance exercise. When you think about, just like you were talking, the mechanisms, the infrastructure, the data that will emerge from instituting more discipline and rigor around these disclosure objectives is absolutely critical to surface more timely where risk disruption can emerge, give insight into choices that can be made, and to your point, levers that to tap into, to help fund, to collaborate with other business partners. I know some of your interviews talk with some really leaders in this space who are doing really innovative things. And when you think about your competitive set, right, a lot of our clients are talking about, again, how do we use this, instill discipline, rigor, just infrastructure to better capture and identify the strategic opportunities before our competitors do. If we're not taking the steps to be able to secure whatever funding mechanisms are out there, whatever innovative, instruments that are out there, then we're falling behind. And so I think, this whole framing of ESG is sort of a data-driven way to understand long-term value. That's really playing out. Now, what is the sentiment from our clients? I think, we're still early on in the early days of digesting the 886 pages from the SEC. Our clients are as well. And so I think there's still, anytime there is such a dramatic shift in requirements of an organization, clearly there's a lot of emphasis on that just sort of table stakes investment that's going to be required for many organizations, even those who have been focused on this and prioritizing sustainability for many years. When you think about this shift from sort of what was sufficient under a voluntary regime to, what infrastructure needs to be in place to meet the requirements of regulation, it will take time and investment. I think the real, those who are thinking about this really strategically are going to think about, how do we do this as quickly as possible so that we can be the ones those fast movers, those early movers who are going to capture the opportunity. Because there's pretty much little question that we are moving rapidly towards a decarbonized economy.
Well, and that was one of the things I was going to ask you is, to be honest, it really kind of seems like the SEC is catching up with the market to me. I mean, the market's been doing this a while, and it's really it seems like a reaction more than being proactive, because not only, I mean, I understand the investors clamoring for it, gives the SEC the excuse, but as you said, a lot of these companies have been focused on sustainability for a long time. You and I have been doing this work a long time. There's companies like General Motors that have been doing this a long time. So, and the market's been demanding it, and the rise of ESG investing, et cetera. So, is this typical? I mean, does the regulators, is it generally perceived as reactive, or are they supposed to be proactive to drive the market in a particular direction?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of ways to look at that. I think very clearly, to your point before, the growing evidence and just consistent emphasis on the financial relevance of climate related risk and opportunity it just continues to be a very strategic focus for organizations. Therefore, as I mentioned, 97% of the S&P 500 report something about climate-related risks already in their filings. Many would suggest that the financial statements themselves already consider ESG as it's factored in. It's just not as transparently called out, disaggregated, and so that was one of the areas I think that caught many by surprise. The fact that the SEC retained an element of the SEC of the SX, so the financial statement footnote disclosure requirement in the final rule, as an opportunity to really put that expectation out, that information that does meet a certain, and in this case, a very clear threshold, a 1% or de minimis threshold for as it relates to costs incurred. So thinking about already information that's reflected in the books and records of the organization, disaggregating that to provide more transparency where what they termed as severe weather events or other natural conditions are impacting the business and are already reflected in the financial statements. And I think that just puts the emphasis on sort of this connectivity that organizations have been talking for years about, in these voluntary disclosures, how they think about climate risk, how it's impacting them, how they're becoming much more sophisticated in how they access data, how they analyze it, how they create scenarios to really sort of anticipate how this risk might manifest, and therefore how they focus their risk responses, what allocation of resources are needed to do that, how that plays into their strategy. And so I think what the rule was really trying to do, again, with that consistent theme around material climate risks and the financial impact, is to draw that out in a more consistent manner that provides that through line in terms of the overall communication that the company is providing. And so I think we just have to keep coming back to the fact that the reason investors care about this information is because it's creating measurable financial impact. I think you started with the stat, and we could go on all day, of all the stats of evidence of the physical impacts of climate change. And so I think it's just a function of how does regulation drive meaningful information in a manner that can be used, and that's really the role.
Oh, that's very powerful. I think it's also, frankly, to level the playing field, because there have been so many companies that have been laggards that are not reporting it, and it became kind of unfair to the companies that felt that they should report it, because it does impact their bottom line in some way, and yet they ended up being somewhat at a competitive disadvantage if their competitors were not reporting it and their numbers looked I don't want to say better, but they were not comparable, right? And they're not fairly comparable. And so I think that is part of the motivation as well. And I think that's an important way of leveling the playing field and gets to the competitive point that you're making as well. Every publicly traded company also has a board of directors with an audit committee. So does this change the audit committee? Does this mean that every audit committee now has to make sure that they have somebody who understands ESG and climate risk disclosure rules on their committee? Do they, what's the impact on the board of directors on this? Does this even change? Maybe it even changes D&O insurance, in an interesting way.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting in terms of how the final rule changed from the proposed rule. There was a lot of attention around the proposed rule included a reference to a named climate expert on the board. And while that explicit requirement or disclosure component was removed, I think it's really clear, I think, for boards, given the emphasis on governance as one of the key pillars and disclosure around what the governance infrastructure looks like. What are the capabilities in terms of just disclosure? It's not a requirement. Thinking about the committee structure, where the oversight resides, what type of information is overseen. Interestingly, as it relates to the disclosure requirements around material climate-related risks, there's no materiality threshold for disclosure of climate-related risks that the board oversees, because there is just an assumption that if the board is overseeing any certain climate-related risks, then it must be material. That's the role of the board. And right. So that's an important, I think, emphasis as companies and boards in particular start to really organize. It's the audit committee for sure, but other parts of the committee structure within the board oversee some of the sort of impacts, dependencies around climate-related matters. And so really thinking about, what do these charters look like for the committees, and reevaluating sort of where that oversight sits today, thinking through to disclosure will really obligate the, being able to actually evidence that not only is oversight assigned within the board or across the board committees, but how it's actually operationalized and put into effect. And so I think those are some of the important considerations for boards as they've been really, I would say boards over the last several years, in my experience, have really been upskilling in this area. There's a tremendous appetite for education, awareness. How do I think about these risks? Again, back to the financial relevance, and how do I execute on my oversight responsibility and appropriately engage with, challenge, support management in the direction of the strategy.
Yeah, I am a faculty on an ESG training program for boards and board prospective board members. And it's kind of interesting because, just as a little side note, one of the things that I personally wrestle with is how much should we expect these people to already know? Mm-hmm. And how much should we just kind of start at the baseline and go? I mean, I'm all for bringing people along with you, but I also understand that if you're at the point of being a potential board director, mm-hmm. we have to assume you have a certain level of business acumen. Yeah. That should not, so it's one of those things that I wrestle with, but that's really interesting to hear you say that. So I want to ask you one other thing and then get some career advice from you, although I could talk to you for about 8 hours about this stuff.
We should do that sometime, Joan.
I know. It's true. One of the things that is fascinating to me, and if you've read any of my stuff, it won't surprise you, but is that I think this is more symptomatic of where the economy writ large. Let's just put it that way. So how do you see the impact of these rules, or what they reflect, on top of the normal economic data that I'm sure you look at in your course of your day job? But what does it tell you about the economy and where the economy is heading, and what the economy, because the economy itself evolves. We went from, obviously we went from a manufacturing driven economy to an information to a digital, and now we're kind of a little bit of everything, right, in some ways. But what does it tell you about where the economy is heading and the economy overall? And I don't mean how many jobs we've created, but I mean kind of what those jobs are now and what kind of talent is needed now and how the whole picture of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that as you think about, and investors talk a lot about, diversification and the fact you can't diversify away from climate risk to the economy, to the capital markets, to society, and sort of the implications of that just very fundamental risk. We can, read headlines from, COP meetings, we can read headlines from Davos, the sort of energy transition, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis are central to the fundamentals of the economy, I think, going forward. And I think organizations see that. Survey after survey indicate that leaders of organizations understand that they need to continue to evolve their strategy in the context of these continuously emerging societal environmental disruptors, with climate change, the energy transition being very central to most investor priorities. And so I think that again, organizations who are staying very close to and in tune to where their strategy is headed and how to overlay some of these considerations into what could disrupt your ability to achieve those strategic objectives. That's just good risk management as well as strategic thinking. And so I just think it's become so much more mainstream in terms of how organizations are already organizing internally. I think we are seeing the need to really drive more timely, consistent disclosure of performance towards these objectives that are so massive. And so that's really the challenge. This is hard. This is really hard. Right. So I do think that as the first couple of years, this is messy. This is really going to be difficult for organizations. But as companies begin to build that discipline, the internal capacity, the strategic focus, they're really going to be able to capture the value, I think, as we start to see some real progress.
Yeah, I think that's great. I love that. I think the definition of risk management has completely flipped over, turned purple, and become polka dot. I mean, it's very different than it was even probably 10 years ago. I mean, it's through various financial cycles and stuff. It's kind of interesting when you think about there's 5 generations in the workforce right now, and one of them went through the Depression, and one of them has never basically, grew up with COVID. And unfortunately active shooter drills in their schools, and never lived through 9/11 and never lived through X, Y, and Z, and really didn't have a recession until, they might have been kids and, 2008, 2009. So the whole frame of reference and what you talked about, stakeholders and future employees earlier, that's part of what I'm thinking about, is that when I say the whole economy, is that you can't just look at it as what you have to report. You have to look at it, as you have and do and describe so eloquently, strategically, from the point of view of all of your stakeholders, not just your investors and not just the regulators. And that's why I said in the beginning of our conversation that though some people may think that regulation and policy and SEC and reporting is wonky and boring and I can tune out, they really can't, because it affects every job on every level, and how you spend your time and how you get from point A to point B, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So thank you for making that point. I really appreciate it. I like to get, as you know, career advice from magical, fabulous women like you. So think about a woman who's mid-career, has, let's say, 15 years of experience. She has an education, she has experience, she knows what she's good at. on what she likes, but she wants to make a difference. She's ambitious. She wants to make money and make a difference. What advice would you have for her to really do all three?
Yeah. Well, at the risk of repeating what I might have said previously, I think the emphasis that we're seeing at this intersection of navigating these increased expectations from a disclosure reporting perspective with the integration of a real strategic focus around climate, as an example, into the business, it requires such a tremendous level of upskilling, change management, education, bringing everyone in the organization along. And so whether you're a marketing leader, whether you're a talent leader, a human resources leader, supply chain, finance, investor relations, legal, pick your favorite, area of the business, really introducing a climate lens to what you do in your day job, and really becoming a champion across your part of the organization. It opens up windows. We participate in meetings with clients all the time where parts of the organization come together that have never really had an opportunity or a remit to collaborate in certain areas. And so I think there's just a tremendous opportunity to bring sort of a tested set of skills, education, activities that are performed, bring that climate lens to really become, a change maker within your organization, a champion within your organization to drive this integration, which is just so fundamental to, what we're all trying to achieve from a strategic perspective, and ultimately generate high quality, reliable information around the company's performance and prospects.
I love that. It's interesting. It reminds me, I sat on the executive committee at Chrysler, and I remember a guy coming in with this brilliant, quote unquote, air quotes, idea. And I let him talk. And after he was done, I said, so let me explain how that's going to play through the system. And I went through like every aspect of the business, including through to our clients and the public, et cetera. And he got mad and he said, well, whose side do you want? And I said, my job is to keep your butt out of the sling. And we're an integrated organism. I mean, every part has to work together. And this is how that's going to affect all this. It's not, no one decision or part can function in a silo. It's part of a gear, Speaking of cars, right? It all has to be integrated. And so it's exactly to your point. One other quick thing I'll share. Somebody approached me recently, and I was surprised this doesn't happen more often, but her title, we're talking about a woman whose title is head of operations and sustainability. Yep. Like, that makes sense. Hello, that's exactly what you're talking about, right? I was like, of course.
Operations, but as you think about where this is all headed, that sort of extended value chain emphasis is really, really central. So it's thinking about not only your operational context, but how that really, integrates into the dependencies that you have, whether it's on suppliers, whether it's on, the environmental conditions of the parts of the world that you operate. So there is such an emphasis on that foundational operation in the four walls, but then extending to how risk can manifest that can actually impact the organization.
Oh, absolutely. And that can lead into the whole scope 3 conversation, which we'll save for another day. Any final thoughts before I let you get back to your day job?
Thanks for the opportunity as always, Joan, and would just, kind of to leave with the message that, again, this emphasis, while compliance will be a critical component, this is such a catalyst for opportunity for thinking about business and your strategy in new and different ways. And really that transformation mindset is absolutely critical.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Definitely have a transformation mindset. So I ascribe to that philosophy. Thank you so much for joining us today on Electric Ladies podcast. Kristen Sullivan of Deloitte, my former employer. It's great to see you again. So what questions do you have for Kristen about the SEC climate rules or California rules or even the EU rules, post them to us on Twitter or Threads at Joan Michelson, and you may win a complimentary 30-minute coaching session with me. And please subscribe to our mailing list to stay abreast of our amazing guests like Kristen, our articles, and career advice and ESG counsel. You can subscribe on our website, electricladiespodcast.com. I'm Joan Michelson. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.